everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
National parks, we like to say, some people say is the greatest American invention. Well, it probably ignores jazz, but it is one of the great American inventions. But it's taken us 150 years to get to 15%. Now the challenge is can we get to half? Well, first, can we get by the end of this decade? Then can we get to half by mid-century? The idea being that if we stay at 15%, in the long run, only about 25% of species can survive. Bump that up to 50%, however, and 85 to 90% of species can survive. Not everything, but enough to keep the place going. Now, in terms of it being realistic, well, it's necessary. So in that sense, it's realistic because I think it was Winston Churchill said of Americans, they always do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I am joined by Tony Hiss, author of 15 books, former journalist at The New Yorker, and former visiting scholar at NYU. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all you do to help so many people stay in touch with what's going on.
So, Tony, you have been a lifelong advocate for the preservation of habitats, both natural and man-made. I wonder where that comes from, and also, how have you personally experienced wildlife?
Well, I think I always had this sense that something stupendous was going on at the edge of our attention. And it turned out that we'd just begun to really explore the world of animals in a way we never had been able to before. Thanks to some technological inventions, like collars that we could put around animals that are so tiny they don't disturb them. And the fact that now the signals from these collars can be picked up by satellites. So you can actually sit in a lab and follow an animal. You don't have to be within half a mile of them to track them. So as we've found out amazing things, and I'm thinking particularly of a wolf in Canada named Pluie, called Pluie because French word for rain is pluie, and she was captured in a blinding rainstorm. They thought, okay, she'll move around a bit. We know that, maybe 60, 65 miles. But and she did, and then her transmitter went dead, and they thought, oh, well, that's technology. 3 months later, they got a call from a NASA engineer saying, your wolf is down here in Montana. It moved hundreds of miles from Canada down to Montana. Over the next 18 months, she crossed 3 US states, 2 Canadian provinces, a land that in outline was much bigger than Yellowstone National Park. So we're just beginning to learn these things. At the same time, the same new knowledge we have is telling us that we're getting rid of so many animals. Over a million species of plants and animals are at imminent risk of extinction. And that's not just a calamity, it's a catastrophe because we rely on all the other living creatures in their various networks to be able to grow the food we need to eat, to be able to have enough clean water to drink, even to draw every other breath, to have enough oxygen in the air. So this is not something we can ignore any longer. And suddenly the world is beginning to pay attention to it the way it has been to climate change. Last December, 188 countries met in Montreal and picked a global goal of trying to protect 30% of the land by the year 2030.
So, Tony, I have to ask you, why personally for you? Why is this important for you? And how have you personally experienced it?
Well, just the fact that when you're outside in nature, so much is happening in a way that never happens even with the most crowded city streets, because there's always something new and different that you never saw before. And that's what caught my eye, both with plants and animals. And it just, there's a phrase among bird watchers, spark bird. And that's the bird that at some point in their life captured their attention, whether it was the flight or the colors or the song, something, and they were hooked thereafter. Their whole life was changed. They couldn't ignore this anymore. For me, it was just realizing how special it is to be out in the nature and outdoors. That just clicked with me, and I've been paying attention ever since.
Well, for someone who absolutely loves nature, and that's really my favorite thing, I think I'm somewhat akin to Scandinavian, citizens, that they really enjoy their free time in the wild, in nature. And of course, that's being aggressively impacted by climate change, as well as just the volatility and uncertainty of weather changes even.
Yes, it's all together.
And we recognize that the value of animals being able to move in these vast wild spaces, and some of that is natural, but some of it's also driven by climate change. Because if you look at fish as an example and other types of mammals, they're being driven further up north, those that are seeking cooler temperature, for instance. So clearly we're seeing that. So help us understand what is necessary to help them survive. But at the same time, we also need to think about how realistic is this, and can these different nations, governments, private and public entities actually support what you're trying to suggest?
Well, you've put your finger on it. Question is it realistic? But let's back up for a second. The problem, as we've said, is that species are disappearing and we need them for our purposes as well as their purposes. The solution that's been put forward is that if we could protect something like half of the planet and allow them to keep going in half of the planet, then we could protect most of life. The thought is, it's taken us 150 years since Yellowstone Park was set up to get to protecting about 15% of the land. National parks, we like to say, some people say, is the greatest American invention. Well, it probably ignores jazz, but it is one of the great American inventions. But it's taken us 150 years to get to 15%. Now the challenge is can we get to half? Well, first, can we get by the end of this decade? Then can we get to half by mid-century? The idea being that if we stay at 15%, in the long run, only about 25% of species can survive. Bump that up to 50%, however, and 85 to 90% of species can survive. Not everything, but enough to keep the place going. Now, in terms of it being realistic, well, it's necessary. So in that sense, it's realistic, because I think it was Winston Churchill said of Americans, they always do the right thing after they've tried everything else, right? So now, and the third part that encourages me is, as I traveled around the continent, I found so many people who are responding to this already that, and doing such amazing work, and many of them not knowing anything about what the next guy was doing, that I feel like people are being drawn in a way that will be a nick of time solution. And the other thing that, in terms of realism, is we're not only learning about how the animals really move, and as you say, sometimes they're pushed by climate, but sometimes problem with national parks, it turned out, is that the animals don't know where the boundaries are, and they wander out. And in case of a wolf like Bluey, no park could be quite big enough. And if we start to build along the edges of these parks, human development, then the animals often can't get back in. So we need to think at different scales to do something about it. But we're learning that this biosphere, this strange container of all life, which as far as we know is unique in the universe, has this amazing ancientness to it, this amazing abundance to it. But we've just sort of begun to realize it has this third dimension, or almost this absence of a third dimension. It's very thin from top to bottom. Most species live in a range between the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. That's only about 12 and a half miles vertical distance. As someone pointed out, lay it out on the ground, you could drive it in less than 20 minutes. So in addition to its robustness and ancientness and amazingness, the biosphere has this built-in thinness, which is a vulnerability that we have to begin to respect. And the other point is that as we learn more and more about the animals and plants around us, and then more and more about the amazing things they're capable of, that elephants are caring and empathetic, that spiders can dream, that octopuses can recognize a human face. A German biologist wrote a book last summer about bees. Bees have a brain no bigger than a poppy seed, and yet they, as he demonstrated, have a rich inner life. So we're surrounded not just by life in all these amazing forms, but by awareness. And one of the implications of that is that there's no such thing as vacant land. There may be land that doesn't have human purposes added to it, but it ain't a vacant lot. It's not empty, it's full of life. So the challenge is to come up with a new way of building and adding our uses that doesn't just automatically displace the life forms already there. I call it all species design.
All right, so let me jump in here because this is not a monologue. Is that you're first of all, you're talking about the book that you recently wrote, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. And you're starting to assert some of those hypotheses or proposals from that book. But I think one of the first basic fundamental question we have to ask is, why half the Earth, and how do you justify that? Where's the research?
Thank you, Scott. I'm glad you brought me back. Yes. Science who studied, some biologists, field biologists who study this have said, on the one hand, that most species seem to need something like at least half of their original habitat to thrive. Now, some are more sensitive, but probably require more land or water, some less so, but strike a balance and rule of thumb 50%. At the same time, the predictive biology is saying that if we don't get to 50%, we're dooming at least 75% of the species and endangering the functioning of the biosphere.
I think there's I'm sure a lot of scientific and modeling underneath that. And I think one of the things that's not clear to me is getting down to the types of species. So is it relevant, the types of species that we try and protect and save more relative to others? Are we willing to let certain species die off? And is that okay? So to help us to understand the framework by which, how do we decide who gets to live and who gets to be extinct?
Well, inevitably, we will lose some, even with the best efforts. There are various ways of focusing on what seems to be tip-top important. Certain animals are considered ecosystem engineers, meaning the differences they make in the landscape protect or are involved with the lives of many, many other species. For instance, beavers building dam change a landscape so that it attracts different trees to the ponds they create. It attracts all kinds of wildlife in the ponds. So we certainly want to make sure that beavers are in a good shape. We're also just beginning to understand that underneath our feet, the soil is kept alive and enriched by enormous networks of fungi, something we've never given much thought to. And at the same time, we want to preserve at least a working sample of every ecosystem that's been here before we started monkeying around. Some of that means protecting things that are in place. Some of it means reconnecting places that have been severed. And some of it means restoring some of the land.
Let's talk about land use and regulation. So there are a number of agencies that oversee everything from parks, land use, to new types of developments. Talk to us about those agencies, their role in this, and what's being done to make sure that we're actually preserving that 50% of the wild animal life, regardless of change in bipartisanship.
Yeah. Yes, it is often a very political issue. There are federal agencies which administer, as you say, vast tracts of land that's held for public purposes. The largest of these is the Bureau of Land Management, which is not the Forest Service and not the Park Service. And often they've tried to strike a balance where they permit a lot of human uses, like extraction and ranching. But some people have thought they could do more in protecting some of these landscapes. And the Biden administration seems to be about to put forward some new thoughts about how they could add that and make it more of a core mission for their work. At the same time, there are states that try to protect their municipalities. And that's, again, very encouraging to me to see how, and land trusts, which are groups of nonprofit groups that help people put conservation easements on their land, so that it will never be built on. And then these are administered as natural areas. I keep running into people who are bubbling up with different ideas. If you have a moment, I'll tell you about one I just ran into. Western New York State, the 8 counties in New York, which is a big state that back up onto Lake Erie. I hadn't known much about it. There's a land trust up there, done good work over the years, protected maybe 10,000 acres in the last 30 years, which is a good track record. Suddenly they're realizing there is this enormous network of forest up there of huge biodiversity value that needs to be protected somehow. And suddenly they've taken on this project of protecting a 1.1 million acre landscape. Wow. So people are thinking at various scales, various levels, whether they're just individuals or parts of groups or parts of government agencies.
So all of this is very hopeful. And I think part of the tone of your book has been around optimism. And that's the right approach. And certainly that's what we hear from other climate activists as well. Now, the challenge, of course, is even if there are intents and even resources applied to this type of protection, the reality is we're very much in a firefighting mode. And I say that in a literal sense, that at the time of this recording, we're probably not even a week or so away before the Montreal fire and the smoke and all the CO2 that was just spewing to the New York tri-state and further even to the south. So the reality is we can't seem to get ahead of these wildfires. These scarce protected lands and land trusts are burning at a rate that we can't control, whether it's Washington, Oregon, up in Canada on the west side or on the east side, certainly California. And if you look at the map of North America, we're losing more potential water sources in the sense of the temperature and the tapping out of underground water sources. So the population is starting to encroach further into the west and further into the east because it's getting drier and drier, which also means that if there's not enough water source for human civilization, what about the wildlife? So there's a lot of tectonic shifts that's happening. Can we really get ahead of this and can we protect these animals?
Yes, despite all of that, we can. There are better ways of managing the forest. Fortunately for us, the forests of Canada are so immense, it's almost impossible for a city kid like me to wrap my mind around their gigantic nature. That boreal forest is probably the most intact and largest natural landscape left on the planet. And it's 3,700 miles long from Alaska to Nova Scotia, and it's at least 1,000 miles deep. It's the frontier landscape that we thought had disappeared a century ago. It's just that we were traveling east to west from New York to California, and we forgot to turn right and go north, where all this landscape still exists today. So many of these little towns you can only reach in tiny airplanes. There are no roads between them.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up Canada's vast boreal forests, and certainly, of course, the Northern Sierras to the Alabama's paint rock forest to the Appalachian Trail. There's a lot of opportunities there. And I think one of the things that I'm not sure if you cover in your book is around carbon tax credit and how some of these new types of schemes that allow for the transference of liability and then accountability of the kinds of CO2 that they're generating. How can something like that start to help protect some of these precious lands?
I think it's one of these situations where everything can help. And carbon tax credits is something that seems to be growing finally by leaps and bounds. And it's a way of saying, well, if I do something not quite so wonderful here, at least it can be offset by something terrific to protect land over here. But at the same time, we can work further on making sure that the interventions we do to earn the tax credits are less invasive than they used to be. For instance, could we reinvent mining at this point? A generation ago, we reinvented surgery so that if someone has a burst appendix, you don't have to gash him open, making a big slice. You can now insert 2, 3 little tiny holes, put miniature lights in one, miniature surgical instruments in the other 2, and snip it out that way. I saw somewhere online a mining company that's bragging that it could do less invasive ways of extracting minerals. That would be wonderful. Laparoscopic mining, can we reinvent so many different parts of what we do so that it has less impact?
Well, one of the things that we've heard from prior guests is around this notion of carrots and sticks. So in Europe, as we speak, there are active opportunities both to encourage reduction of carbon output, but also to punish or penalize those that continue to do so, including lack of a plan to decarbonize. In the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we're definitely seeing the spurring of clean energy and transition from the traditional oil and gas to clean energies like wind, solar, and hydrogen, for example. However, I'm not sure that we necessarily have the sticks in place, at least in the US. How do we ensure that not only do we encourage and stimulate and incent, but also to make sure we hold companies accountable in the case of, let's say, mining oil and gas, and we know that's going to continue? How do we make sure that the enforcement, in a way, or the scarcity effectively encourages innovation to the point that you made?
Another very good question, Scott, and it will be tough. Americans seem to respond better to carrots than to sticks. So I think maybe we should try and up the ratio of carrots and make them more enticing. Yes, businesses respond to stimuluses like grants, or in fact, the whole effort now to shift microchip production into U.S. soil is seeing a boom, thanks to the 2 pieces of legislation that Biden was able to get passed. Sticks sometimes work better as guidance than as requirements, but it also depends on who you're asking to do what and how much of a sacrifice it feels like to them you're asking them to make. The Biden administration has its own 30 by 30 program, but from the outset they said there is no eminent domain here. No one is going to be required to protect land by having the government taking it away from them. We're only interested in people willing to cooperate. And in fact, that's true. This can't be solved. This only can be solved if everyone realizes how important it is and finds a way to get involved. It's going to take a huge cohort of us to get there.
So I'm really glad that you brought up this notion of cooperation beyond government agencies and federal and even state level. Is that the reality much of the land in America, the vastness, certainly the middle part, is owned by Bill Gates. And then, of course, it's owned by many, many hundreds, if not thousands of landowners, private landowners. They all have a play into this overall approach. What is their responsibility and how should they be held accountable?
Some of these enormous landowners, Ted Turner, for instance, deliberately made his vast ranches into natural areas. They were at the same time working ranches. He grows bison, but at the same time has welcomed wolves back onto this property. Others are less concerned, but doesn't mean they can't hear about what Ted did. Ted's making money doing it. It's not as if he's sacrificing the value of his ranches. So many people have to get involved by realizing that there's something calling out to them that needs to be done or can be done. For instance, there's a guy named Doug Tallamy who has a wonderful idea for what he calls homegrown national parks, which means suburban people who have a bit of lawn, if they take even a tiny strip of that lawn and replant it with native plants, suddenly bees and butterflies come and the pollinators are back in business. A guy I know up north of New York City in Westchester County has the same idea. He's got some woods in the back of his small piece of property, but they're overgrown with vines now and they're in bad shape. So this is not so much a grassroots campaign as a tree roots campaign. He wants to organize his neighbors to start taking back these invasive vines to bring more health to small pieces of woodland and band together with others around the town. So again, that's why I say ideas are bubbling up in ways you would never suspect. People seeing someone in a city, for instance, with no green in sight, can get involved with changing the way streetlights are directed. Light that goes up in the air is very confusing at nighttime to moths and birds. Birds fly into buildings. Moths, as we've always said, are attracted to light. Well, it turns out it's not that they're attracted to light, it's that the light completely discombobulates their visual and active systems, and they get confused and fly around and bump into the lights. So things are possible to get involved with just about anywhere.
So I really appreciate these very tangible and practical examples. And certainly for myself, I can tell you that we have been very intentional about planting native species in our garden to exactly that. A few years ago, we didn't have natural bees. We just had a few bumblebees, but now we have a diversity of different types of bees, and of course, all the other types of birds and animals along with it. So these are very practical advice, and I am so glad that there's something that tangible that the listeners can take away. My finishing question comment is going to be around how is this half-Earth movement potentially polarizing? We talked about realism a little bit, but then are there potential winners, but also losers in this model? And who are they?
Another good and complicated question. For one thing, there are people we haven't involved much until recently, and that is indigenous people, Native Americans, First Nations. A lot of the large landscapes that are still intact are the homelands for these people. And they can have knowledge of how these places work because they've lived in them for so long. The Canadians are finally turning to their First Nations, asking them to set up something almost like a second national park system that they will run. So that's changing things. In terms of winners and losers, we've got to begin to think in terms of the other life forms not being losers when we add our purposes. That's what I talked about for a moment, is all species design. How do we add what we need to add to a place that we've formerly called vacant land, and it ain't vacant because it's full of life, without dislodging or displacing or eradicating and eliminating and extincting the life that's already there?
Well, I am very appreciative of this conversation. Thank you for the book that you have written, and I certainly hope that others read it because it provides a way out and it's practical. So with that, I have been joined by Tony Hiss, the author of Rescuing the Planet. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.